Have you ever noticed how, even when everything seems to be silent around you, your mind keeps making noise as if it never turned off? As if there was a constant voice, repeating worries, memories, fears. And you try to ignore it, but the harder you try, the stronger it seems to get. What if I told you that this restlessness is not just tiredness, but a sign of something deeper going on inside you? It's as if time slows down in these moments. You lie down, close your eyes, and instead of rest, it finds a whirlwind. Thoughts that come back, scenes that repeat themselves, words that someone said years ago still echoing as if they were from now. A feeling that is difficult to explain, an invisible but real weight. And the most intriguing thing is that, on the outside, perhaps no one notices. But inside, there is a silent battle going on every day. Now there is something that almost no one has told you. Something old, forgotten, hidden between the lines of Scripture. A kind of spiritual key that does not depend on your strength, nor on your intelligence, but on an understanding that few achieve. Something that has always been available, but which remains invisible to the majority. And perhaps this is exactly what explains why so many people continue to be stuck in their own thoughts, even seeking help, answers, relief. Because the truth is that it's not just about calming the mind. There is a way to clean it from the inside out. A way that does not begin with human effort, but with spiritual alignment. And when that happens, something changes. The weight begins to come off. Confusion gives way to clarity. And that which once dominated you, it loses its strength. There is a way. It is not common. It's not obvious. But it works. It is recorded, revealed, and available as a code hidden in simple but power-laden words. A type of direction that transforms not only what you think, but who you become. Today, you will have access to this. Not as a theory, but as something alive. Something that can start to act within you today. But there is a silent condition. You have to stay, listen carefully, and allow each word to find space within you. Because what is about to be revealed, it doesn't just change thoughts. It changes destinations. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans 12:2, on this path we begin now. You will discover deep and little talked about principles about how God works within the human mind, cleansing, restoring, and bringing order where there was once confusion. Each teaching, each biblical passage, and each example was chosen to show you, in a practical way, how to overcome negative thoughts, silence anxiety, and recognize when something invisible is trying to steal your peace. As you continue, you will realize how God speaks subtly, how He corrects thoughts without violence, and how your mind can become a place of rest, direction, and spiritual strength. And maybe you haven't even noticed, but the mere fact of being here now is already part of something bigger. There is a purpose in this. So, as you listen, allow yourself to open your heart, and if that message touches you in any way, like this video and subscribe, because it can bring that same light to someone who also needs to find peace. Destroying counsels, and every lofty thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing every mind captive to the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians 10:5. There is something you need to understand now, because it completely changes the way you see your own mind. Humanity's first battle did not take place with weapons, nor with physical force. It happened inside the mind. In the Garden of Eden, everything was in perfect order. There was no pain, fear, or confusion. But even in this perfect environment, something entered quietly. It was not a visible attack. It was an idea. The serpent did not begin by offering the fruit. She started with a question. A simple question, seemingly innocent, but loaded with intention. Is this how God said? And in that instant, something changed. Because when Eve heard that, she didn't fall immediately, she began to think. And that's exactly where the danger begins. Notice this carefully. The enemy doesn't need to knock you down at once. He just needs to plant a doubt. A small distortion. A thought that seems harmless, but that begins to repeat itself inside the mind. And when you start to dialogue with this thought, it grows. He gains space. It starts to feel true. That's what happened. Eve began to consider something that God never said that way. The truth was distorted gently until it seemed acceptable. And before she even touched the fruit, she had already accepted the idea inside her mind. The fall began in thought, not action. And maybe now you're starting to notice something. How many times do thoughts pop into your mind in the same way? like subtle questions as doubts, as suggestions that seem yours, but carry weight, fear, insecurity. Thoughts that say you won't make it, that something will go wrong, that God isn't watching, that you're alone. These thoughts do not come screaming. They arrive in a whisper, and when they are not interrupted, they begin to take root. Because thoughts are seeds, and every seed, when it remains, produces something. It can produce life or it can produce destruction. That's why clearing the mind isn't optional. It is spiritual. It's a matter of protection. Because what you allow to remain in your thoughts, sooner or later, influences your decisions, your emotions, and the direction of your life. God has always known this. Therefore, from the beginning, he warns, teaches, and directs, because a mind that is aligned with truth stands firm. But a mind exposed to constant doubt becomes vulnerable. Is this how God said? Genesis 3:1. And if you stop to think about it, this same question still echoes today, in different forms, trying to confuse, distort, and distance you from the truth. But now you're starting to see. And when you see, you are no longer dominated in the same way. If this message from God is speaking to you in a special way, perhaps it is no accident. Perhaps today is the day to realize what previously went unnoticed. If something touched your heart right now, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word is the beginning of a quiet transformation that changes everything. And this is exactly where Jesus enters in a direct way, almost uncomfortable for those who have never stopped to look inside. While many were concerned with external rules, with rituals, with appearance and visible behavior, Jesus breaks with all this and points to something much deeper. He looks at people and practically says, the problem is not outside, is inside. That changes everything. Because until then, most believed that it was enough to avoid certain attitudes to be at peace with God. But Jesus begins to reveal that you can even control what you do on the outside and yet be dominated from within. He exposes a truth that few want to face. Thoughts also carry spiritual weight. When he says that evil thoughts proceed from the heart, he is revealing the invisible root of everything. Before any visible error, before any wrong attitude, there was already a thought that was fed. Nothing starts outside. It all starts inside the mind, in the silence, where no one sees but where everything is formed. And maybe that explains something you've already felt, that internal struggle that no one notices. Those thoughts that you didn't even want to have, but that appear. Sometimes you even try to ignore it, try to distract yourself, try to occupy your mind, but they keep coming back. And that is tiring. That weighs heavily. This confuses. Jesus does not ignore this reality. On the contrary, he brings light to it. He shows that true cleanliness is not just about avoiding the mistake, but about treating the source. It's not about appearance, it's about inner transformation. And that requires a new kind of attention, not just to what you do, but to what you think. Because when the mind is not taken care of, it becomes a vulnerable place. But when it is aligned with the truth, it becomes a place of strength. And Jesus is, all the time, trying to teach that. He confronts not to condemn, but to liberate. He exposes not to shame, but to heal. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts. Matthew 15:19, and this speech is not just a warning, it is an invitation. An invitation to look inward with sincerity, to realize that real change begins in a place that no one sees, but that defines everything. Because when God transforms the mind, the rest begins to align naturally. If this word is awakening in you something profound, as if it were a silent call to change from within, respond to it now. Comment, speak, Lord, your servant hears. Write it as a sincere prayer, and leave your like on this video, because this message can reach someone who also needs to understand that true transformation starts in the mind. There is a detail in the path of Jesus that many ignore, but which reveals one of the greatest secrets about mastery of the mind. Before he began his ministry, before he performed miracles, before he taught multitudes, he was led into the wilderness. And it was not by chance. The desert wasn't just about hunger or loneliness. It was a mental training ground. There, without distractions, without applause, without comfort, everything intensifies. The silence of the desert makes thoughts get louder. And it is exactly in this scenario that the confrontation takes place. Satan does not appear with weapons or physical force. It comes with words, with suggestions, with subtle distortions of the truth. Notice this deeply. The attack was not physical, it was mental. If thou art the Son of God, this phrase carries an attempt to shake identity. It is not a direct denial. It is a planted doubt. The same strategy as Eden, now being used again. Questioning who you are, to destabilize what you think. And every temptation followed that pattern. It wasn't about the bread, it was about making Jesus act outside of God's time. It wasn't about throwing yourself out of the temple, it was about testing the faithfulness of the Father. It wasn't about worship, it was about exchanging purpose for shortcuts. Everything was an attempt to confuse, accelerate, distort. But Jesus responds in a way that reveals a powerful principle. He doesn't argue. He doesn't argue with emotion. He doesn't react impulsively. He answers with the word, with absolute truth, with something that doesn't change. While the enemy distorts, Jesus aligns. As doubt tries to enter, he establishes conviction. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4 this here completely changes the way we face thoughts. Because Jesus shows that it's not about trying to push out ideas with effort. It's about replacing them with truth. It's about having something stronger inside you than what tries to confuse you. And maybe your desert isn't a physical place. Maybe it's a time in your life where you feel alone, pressured, tired, where thoughts come with more intensity. But this place, as it was with Jesus, can become a space of strengthening, not defeat. Because when you learn to respond in the right way, the mind stops being vulnerable and starts to become firm, not because thoughts stop coming, but because they no longer find room to remain. And if at this moment something inside you is being strengthened, even if silently, turn it into a small attitude of faith. Write in the comments, "God is my strength." A simple phrase, but one that can mark a new position within your mind from now on. After facing prophets, challenging an entire nation, and watching fire fall from heaven, Elijah experiences something almost no one expects: an internal breakdown. That same man who demonstrated an unshakable faith in front of everyone now finds himself alone, afraid, and completely exhausted. This reveals a profound and often ignored truth. Even the spiritually strongest can reach a limit in the mind. And maybe it touches something inside you right now, because there are times when, on the outside, everything seems to be under control, but inside, there is a fatigue that is difficult to explain. An exhaustion that is not only physical, but emotional and spiritual. Elijah reaches a point where he asks to die. Not because he lost his faith, but because his mind was overloaded. And notice how God reacts. He does not rebuke Elijah. It does not accuse. It does not require explanations. God begins by taking care of the basics. He gives rest. He allows him to regain strength. This already shows something powerful. A clean and healthy mind starts with care, not with demand. After that, God calls Elijah to a meeting, and at that moment something remarkable happens. A strong wind passes, but God is not in the wind. An earthquake happens, but God is not in the earthquake. A fire arises, but God is not in the fire. And then a whisper comes, a still, almost imperceptible voice. And after the fire, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. This completely changes the way we understand how God works in the mind. Because many times something great is expected, an instant change, an intense response. But God chooses to speak in silence, calmly, in the place where the mind begins to slow down. And perhaps what you need most today is not more information, more haste or more pressure, but of a moment of pause where that soft voice can be heard. Because it is there that the mind begins to reorganize itself. That's where the weight starts to come off. It is there that God begins to restore what was worn out. Elias didn't leave that meeting just rested. It left renewed with direction and purpose restored. This shows that God does not abandon tired minds. He approaches them with care and patience. If you are here so far, it is because something within you recognizes this truth. There is a process going on, even if silent. And later on, we will enter a deep time of prayer where all of this begins to become even more real within you. So stay, because this isn't just a video. It is an encounter that can transform the way you live all your thoughts from today. There is a point in the spiritual journey that changes everything, and David reveals this in an extremely human and profound way. He wasn't just a king or warrior. He was someone who felt intensely, and at various times his mind was invaded by sadness, fear, and anguish. But what differentiates David is not the absence of these thoughts, it's the way he reacts to them. Instead of accepting what he was feeling as absolute truth, David does something unusual. He begins to talk to his own soul. He does not surrender to thought, he confronts. He questions what is trying to dominate him. This is powerful, because it shows that not every thought should be obeyed. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? Why do you trouble yourself within me? Psalms 42:11. Notice the depth of this. He doesn't say I'm down. He separates his soul from what he is feeling, as if to say this is happening inside me, but it does not define who I am. And soon after, he does something even stronger. He directs his own mind to God. He declares hope, even when he doesn't feel it. This reveals a secret that few people apply. The mind needs to be led. Because if you just follow what you feel, you get lost. But when you start directing your thoughts based on truth, something starts to change internally. How many times have you found yourself stuck in thoughts that only pull you down? Thoughts that discourage, that make you doubt, that take away your peace. And without realizing it, you start agreeing with them. It begins to repeat internally, as if it were true. This is how the mind becomes a heavy place. David shows a different path. He teaches that there is spiritual authority even over what you think, that you can stop a thought and redirect, that you can choose not to feed that which weakens you. And that doesn't mean denying what you feel, it means not allowing it to control you. It is an active posture. It is a decision. It's an inner positioning that begins to align your mind with God even before circumstances change. Because when you start talking to your soul in the right way, something starts to rearrange itself. The confusion loses strength. The discouragement begins to subside. And little by little, the mind that was previously dominated starts to be led. Maybe today is the day you stop just listening to your thoughts and start responding to them. Not with any words, but with truth, with faith, with direction, just like David did. And if that truth made sense to you right now, turn it into a small act of faith. Write in the comments, Lord, I receive your teachings. Make it a simple statement, but loaded with intention. And leave your like, because this message can reach other people who also need to learn to lead their own mind. There is something that many people do not realize, and this explains why it so often seems that the mind even improves, but then it returns to the same state. Paul reveals that clearing the mind is not a one-time event. It is not something that happens once, and that's it. It is a continuous, daily, intentional process. Just as the body needs constant care, the mind also needs to be renewed every day, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Ephesians 4:23, this word renew carries the idea of something that is always being updated, restored, adjusted. It is not automatic. It doesn't happen without participation. There is a spiritual responsibility in this. Because the mind, if it is not taken care of, naturally begins to accumulate that, which does not come from God. And maybe you've already experienced it. Days when it seems that everything is fine, your mind is light, clear. But all it takes is a moment, a piece of news, a memory, and everything starts to get mixed up again. Thoughts come back, emotions intensify, and that peace seems to slip away. This is because the mind needs spiritual maintenance. It's not about living a strong moment and then forgetting. It's about creating a habit of alignment. Small daily decisions that added together completely transform the way we think. Paul is teaching that there is discipline in this, not a heavy discipline, but a constancy. Choose what goes into your mind. Choose what you think. Choose what you feed internally. Because all this builds or destroys. And here's something profound. The mind is never empty. It is always being filled with something. Either you feed your mind with truth, or it will be automatically filled with noise, fear, and confusion. There is no middle ground. Therefore, daily renewal is not just a recommendation, it is a protection. It's what keeps your mind aligned even when the world around you is in disarray. It's what gives you stability when emotions try to take you somewhere else. And it starts simply. A moment with God. A word you keep. A decision not to feed a negative thought. Small attitudes that, repeated, begin to change everything inside. Over time, you realize that your mind no longer reacts in the same way. What once shook you now no longer has the same effect. Not because the problems have disappeared, but because his mind was strengthened. And if you feel that this truth makes sense for the moment you are living, maybe this is no coincidence. God works like this, silently, constantly, daily. And you can be part of it in an active way. If this message is already touching your heart, don't ignore it. When you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, you help that word reach other people who also need to renew their minds. Be a part of it now. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and allow this current of faith to continue reaching lives. There is an area of the mind that almost no one sees, not even the people closest to us, but that silently influences everything. They are the hidden thoughts, those that you don't talk about, that you don't share, that you often try to ignore, but who are still there, acting behind the scenes of his life. And the deepest thing about it is that these thoughts, even hidden, are not neutral. They shape decisions, affect emotions, influence attitudes. It is like an invisible root that determines the type of fruit that appears on the outside. And many times the person tries to change behaviors, tries to adjust attitudes, but does not realize that the origin remains intact. God does not work only in what is visible. He looks inside, he sees what no one else sees, and not with the aim of exposing or condemning, but to heal completely. Because a superficial cleaning can even bring momentary relief, but it doesn't really transform. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Psalms 139:23. This statement is profound, because it requires courage. To ask God to probe is to relinquish control. It is to allow Him to reveal even that which you may not want to see. Hidden thoughts, unresolved intentions, stored feelings, everything that has been accumulated over time. And here is an important point. What is not treated is strengthened. Thoughts that are hidden gain space. They start out small, barely noticeable, but over time they can become patterns. And when they become standards, they start to look normal. How many times does an insecurity start as a light thought, and then it becomes a belief? How often does a silent fear begin to limit decisions? How many times are negative memories kept, and without realizing it, begin to influence the present? That is why God calls for something deeper, not just changing what appears, but clean up what's hidden. And this does not happen automatically. It requires surrender, sincerity, and a willingness to look inside with truth. But there is something comforting in all this. When God reveals, He also restores. He doesn't show to hurt. It shows to heal. Every thought exposed to the light loses strength. Each area delivered begins to be transformed. And maybe, as you listen to this, someone has come to your mind. Someone who is also carrying heavy, silent thoughts that no one sees. This is no coincidence. This moment can be more than just listening. It can be an act of faith. Write that person's name in the comments. It could be someone in your family, a friend, or even yourself. In doing so, you join a chain of prayer, where each name represents a life being presented before God. And something begins to happen when we put these people in His presence. There's one silent truth that defines your entire life, even if you've never stopped to think about it. Your mind is never neutral. Right now, she's busy with something, and what occupies your mind determines who is ruling your life. There is no empty space. Either your mind becomes an altar, or it becomes a battlefield. And maybe now it starts to make sense to you. There are days when your mind feels like a place of peace, where everything flows, where there is clarity, direction, even a sense of presence. But there are other days in which it seems that a war is going on inside you. Thoughts clash, doubts arise, emotions mix, and you feel like you're being pulled in all directions at once. What changes from one moment to the next is not just the circumstances, it is what is occupying your mind, because the mind is like an invisible altar. And every altar will always have something being placed on it. It could be faith or fear, it may be true or lie. It could be the voice of God or the constant noise of worry. Thou shalt keep in peace him whose mind is set upon thee. Isaiah 26:3. This verse reveals something powerful. Peace is not a chance, it is a consequence. It's not something that just pops up. It is something that is generated when the mind is grounded in God. This means focus, constancy, decision. Because keeping a steady mind isn't automatic, it is a daily choice. And here's the deeper point. What you allow to remain in your mind begins to govern your emotions, your reactions, and even your decisions. If the mind is full of worry, life begins to be guided by fear. If it is full of doubt, everything becomes unstable. But when the mind begins to be filled with the presence of God, something changes inside. It doesn't mean that the problems disappear, but they no longer dominate. It doesn't mean that negative thoughts cease to exist, but they no longer have authority, because there is something bigger occupying this space. Turning the mind into an altar does not happen by chance. It is a daily construction. It is choosing, even in the midst of chaos, to turn one's thoughts to God. It is deciding, even when it is not easy, not to feed what steals your peace. It's a quiet but extremely powerful process. And maybe, without realizing it, you're already starting this process now. Every word you hear, every reflection that comes in, begins to reorganize that inner space. And little by little, what was a war field begins to transform into a meeting place. Nothing happens by chance. If you've made it this far, there's a reason. Continue to the end, because there is still something deeper being prepared for you to live with, something that can completely change the way you deal with your thoughts every day. There is a subtle but decisive difference between listening and acknowledging. Many people believe that God does not speak, when, in fact, what is missing is not the voice, it is the discernment. Samuel's story reveals this in a profound way. He was in the right place, in the right environment, close to the things of God. But when the voice came, he couldn't identify it. This shows something that still happens today. An untrained mind, you can treat the divine as something casual or completely ignore that which could change everything. Samuel hears his name being called during the night. He gets up, runs to Eli, believing that he was the one who had called. This happens more than once. Imagine that moment. God speaking, and the boy not realizing that it was the Lord himself. Not for lack of will, but for lack of sensitivity. And how many times does this also happen silently in life? Thoughts that arise bringing direction, an alert and inexplicable peace, but they are ignored, confused, or even discarded. Because in the midst of so much internal noise, everything seems the same. The mind, when it is full of distractions, worries, and excess of information, loses the ability to discern. Everything becomes just another thought. And that's why mind cleansing isn't just about taking away what is bad. It's about creating space to recognize what comes from God. There is a difference between ordinary thought and divine direction. One brings heaviness, confusion, and haste. The other, even when he corrects, comes with clarity, firmness, and a peace that does not depend on the circumstances. But to realize this, inner silence is necessary. And this silence does not mean the absence of sound around, it means calming the inside. Slow down the pace of thoughts. Stop reacting to everything immediately. Create a space where the mind stops being a hectic place and starts to become sensitive. It was only when Samuel received guidance that something changed. He went back to the same place, heard the voice again. But this time he answered differently. Then the Lord came and stood there and called as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel," and Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant hears." 1 Samuel 3:10. This response reveals an available heart and an adjusted mind. It's not just listening, it is to be ready to recognize and respond. And that completely transforms the way someone lives. Because when you learn to discern God's voice, your mind ceases to be a place of constant doubt and becomes a space of direction. Decisions become clearer. Paths begin to make sense. And that inner confusion begins to give way to a silent certainty. This kind of sensitivity is not born out of nowhere, it is built. And every step of this journey is bringing you closer to exactly that place. There are memories that are not only in the past. They continue to live inside the mind, influencing emotions, decisions, and even the way you see yourself. These are memories that, even old, still have strength. Situations that marked, words that hurt, moments that left invisible scars. And the most difficult thing is that, many times, these memories come back without warning, rekindling feelings that seemed already overcome. Joseph knew this kind of pain well. He was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, wronged, forgotten. If there was anyone with reasons to carry bitterness, it was him. And yet, something inside him remained intact. His mind was not dominated by the pain he experienced. This reveals a profound principle about mental cleansing. It's not about erasing the past, but about transforming the way it's interpreted. Because what imprisons is not only what happened, it is the meaning you give to what happened. Many people live attached not to the facts, but to the way those facts were recorded in the mind. A betrayal can become constant distrust. A rejection can turn into a feeling of inadequacy. A loss can generate permanent fear. And without realizing it, life begins to be guided by these marks. But Joseph chose a different path. He decided to look at everything he experienced from a greater perspective. He didn't deny the pain, he didn't pretend it didn't happen, but he also did not allow that to define who he would become. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis 50:20. This statement is not common. It reveals a mind that has been healed. Because only someone free inside can see purpose where before there was only suffering. Joseph understood that, even in the most difficult situations, God was present, leading, molding, preparing, and that changes everything. Because when you start to see your story through God's perspective, memories stop being prisons and become parts of a process. What once hurt begins to teach. What seemed meaningless begins to fall into place. The healing of the mind goes through this place. It's not forgetting. It is resignifying. It is allowing God to enter the memories and bring a new reading, a new understanding. It is to free yourself not from the past itself, but from the weight it still carries within you. And perhaps, as you listen to this, some memory has come to your mind. Something that still needs to be healed, reorganized, delivered. This does not happen by chance. That word didn't come to you for no reason. There is something being played inside. And if you felt this, even if lightly, write in the comments, "I trust in God." Make it a small act of faith, as someone who decides to surrender even what he does not yet fully understand. There is an essential point that many do not realize when they talk about a clear mind. It's not just about removing negative thoughts, as if it were an empty space being organized. True transformation happens when that space is filled with something bigger, with the very presence of God. Because an empty mind does not remain empty for long. It needs to be occupied, and what occupies it defines what it becomes. Moses lived under a pressure that few could bear. He carried the responsibility of leading an entire people, dealing with constant complaints, unexpected challenges and decisions that affected thousands of lives. Humanly speaking, it was the kind of situation that could easily lead anyone to mental exhaustion. But there was something that sustained Moses invisibly but powerfully. It wasn't just emotional strength. It wasn't just experience. It was the presence of God. And that makes all the difference, because when the mind is full of problems, it gets disorganized. When it is full of pressure, it gets confused. But when it is filled with God's presence, something begins to line up inside, not because the difficulties disappear, but because there is a higher order occupying that space. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Exodus 33:14. This promise does not speak only of a physical rest. It speaks of an inner rest. A place where the mind finds stability, even when everything around it seems unstable. And this is something that is not built from the outside in, but from the inside out. Moses understood that there was no point in moving forward without this presence. At a decisive moment, he practically declares that he did not want to take a single step if God did not go with him. This reveals a deep awareness. More important than any answer is presence. And maybe here's something that can change the way you've been dealing with your thoughts. Because often the attempt is to control, organize, eliminate what bothers us. But the real secret is in substituting, in allowing God to occupy this space in a real way. When God's presence becomes constant, the mind begins to find direction without excessive effort. Peace is no longer something distant and becomes an internal reality. And even in difficult times, there is a security that sustains. This does not happen all at once. It is built. It is cultivated. It is a daily choice to get closer, to make space, to value this presence above anything else. And little by little, what was once confusion is giving way to clarity. If you are here, it is not by chance. There is something being aligned within you, even if it is not yet entirely clear. Stay until the end, because what is being revealed here can become a practical key for you to live a lighter, firmer, and deeper mind with God every day. There is a type of thought that does not arrive as a direct attack, but settles silently, almost imperceptibly. And when you realize it, he has already taken up too much space. Anxiety works like this. It starts as a light concern, something seemingly normal, even acceptable, but little by little it grows, occupying the mind, taking away peace, and stealing the ability to live in the present. Jesus confronts this in a direct, but at the same time profound way. He doesn't treat anxiety just as an emotion. He reveals the root of it. Anxiety is born when the mind tries to take control that was not made for it. It's when you try to anticipate the future, predict scenarios, avoid pain that hasn't even happened yet. All this without resting in God. And maybe you've felt it. That feeling of always thinking about what can go wrong. Creating situations in the mind. Trying to prepare for everything, but deep down, getting more and more tired. Because the mind was not created to carry the weight of tomorrow. Do not be anxious about tomorrow. Matthew 6:34, this is not just a guideline, it is an invitation to freedom. Jesus is saying that there is a way of living where the mind does not need to be stuck in the future, where you can live today more lightly because there is someone taking care of what is yet to come. Anxiety deep down is an attempt to control what is out of reach. It's as if the mind says, if I think enough, maybe I can avoid, solve, or anticipate. But that never brings peace, it only increases the weight. And here's the deeper point. Clearing the mind involves learning to let go, deliver, trust. Not in a theoretical way, but in a real way. It's an internal decision to recognize that not everything depends on you, that there is greater care, greater direction, protection that goes beyond what your thoughts can reach. Jesus points to simple things, the birds, the lilies, showing that there is a constant care of God in everything. And if He takes care of such small details, how much more of your life? But to live this, the mind needs to leave the place of control and enter the place of trust. That doesn't mean anxious thoughts will never arise again, but it does mean that you no longer have to be attached to them. You can recognize it, but not feed it. You can perceive, but not give in. Because now there is a new way to deal with it. And perhaps, at this moment, you are recognizing areas of your life where anxiety has been taking up space. Repetitive thoughts, constant worries, but also a desire to live differently. If this makes sense to you, turn this moment into a small act of faith. Write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word carries a quiet decision to trust more and worry less, making room for God to act where there was only restlessness before. There is a silent difference between trying to avoid bad thoughts and really transform the mind. Many people spend their entire lives fighting against what they don't want to think, as if the mind can be controlled only by denial. But the more they try to push certain thoughts away, the more they seem to come back. This happens because the mind is not renewed by emptiness, it is renewed by filling. When God speaks to Joshua, He doesn't just give a mission, He delivers a strategy. Joshua was about to take on enormous responsibility, to lead an entire people, to make difficult decisions, to face constant challenges. And God doesn't just tell him to be strong, God teaches how to keep your mind steady in the midst of all this. Let not the book of this law depart from thy mouth, but meditate on it day and night. Joshua 1:8, this instruction reveals a powerful principle. The mind must be continually connected with the truth. Meditating is not just reading or repeating. It is to absorb, to reflect, to allow those words to enter deeply and begin to shape the way of thinking. Because the Word of God is not just information, it is transformation. It acts as a water that cleanses, that removes dirt accumulated over time, that takes away distortions, lies, fears that have been built inside the mind. And the more this word takes up space, the less space is left for what it once dominated. Perhaps you've noticed how certain thoughts seem to lose strength when you connect with something deeper. It's no coincidence. It is a direct effect of the truth occupying the place where there was confusion before. And here's the secret that many ignore. It's not enough just to avoid what is bad. It is necessary to replace it with that which strengthens. Because if the mind is not filled with truth, it will automatically be filled by something else. And this something else does not always come from a healthy place. Joshua was instructed to keep this constant, day and night. This speaks of continuity, of discipline, of something that becomes part of the routine, not as a heavy obligation but as a source of life, like a food that sustains the mind and keeps everything aligned. And when this starts to happen, change is inevitable. Thoughts begin to organize, decisions become clearer, faith is strengthened, and that feeling of being lost inside one's own mind begins to disappear. Because a mind filled with the Word is not vulnerable in the same way. It starts to have a base, direction, stability. Not because challenges never arise again, but because now there is something inside that sustains. And perhaps, without realizing it, you are already being led to that place. Every word you hear here begins to plant something new within you. And this will still deepen in a way that you might not expect. This word is not for any time. If you've made it this far, there's something being prepared especially for you. Stay, because what is yet to come can open up an understanding that will completely change the way you feed your mind every day. There is a type of prison that has no visible bars, but limits every step of a person's life. It's not on the outside, it is inside the mind. They are repeated thoughts, silent beliefs that are built over time until they become indisputable truths within someone. I'm not capable. I'm not enough. That's not for me. And the most dangerous thing is that, after a while, the person no longer questions. It just accepts. Gideon lived just like that. While the people suffered at the hands of the enemies, they were in hiding, trying to survive, seeing themselves as the smallest, the weakest, the least prepared. The vision he had of himself was completely limited. And many times, when someone lives like this for a long time, they begin to believe that this is the ultimate reality. But then God enters the scene, and everything starts to change from a single statement. The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. Judges 6:12, that phrase doesn't make sense to Gideon at that time, because he doesn't see himself that way. Your mind is conditioned to believe the opposite. And here's something profound. God didn't speak based on what Gideon felt. God spoke based on the truth he saw. This reveals one of the biggest secrets about clearing the mind. It's not just about removing negative thoughts, but to replace internal lies with the truth of God. Because as long as the mind is full of distorted ideas about who you are, your life will always be limited by it. Gideon had to go through a process. God didn't just call him. God began to deconstruct every belief that kept him imprisoned. Every doubt, every fear, every feeling of inability was confronted, not with accusation, but with direction. And maybe that touches directly on something inside of you right now, because there are thoughts that you have been carrying for years, ideas about yourself that were formed by experiences, other people's words, difficult moments. And without realizing it, it started to define how far you think you can go. But the truth is that not everything you believe about yourself comes from God. And as long as these lies remain, they function as invisible boundaries. Clearing the mind is also having the courage to question these beliefs. It is to look within and recognize, what I think about myself is in line with what God says, or was it something I accepted over time? Because when God's truth begins to occupy that space, something changes. Identity is strengthened. Insecurity begins to lose strength, and what seemed impossible begins to be seen in another way. God doesn't see you stuck with your current version, He sees beyond. And when you begin to see yourself from His perspective, the mind ceases to be a place of limitation, and it becomes a place of continuous transformation. There is a point in the spiritual journey that few value, but which carries a profound power of transformation. Silence. Not just the outer silence, but the one that happens within the mind. Because there are times when the problem is not the lack of answers. It is the excess of noise that prevents you from perceiving them. Habakkuk arrived exactly at this place. He was restless, full of questions, trying to understand what was happening around him. His mind was agitated, looking for explanations, wanting quick answers, trying to organize everything. And the more he thought, the more confused he seemed to become. That's familiar, isn't it? When the mind tries to solve everything at the same time, when thoughts accumulate, when each question generates another, and suddenly you find yourself stuck in a cycle that doesn't bring clarity, only tiredness. And then God answers, but not in the way that many would expect. But the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before Him. Habakkuk 2:20. This answer does not provide a direct explanation. She brings an invitation, a call to silence. As if God were saying, before trying to understand everything, be still. Before looking for answers, organize the interior, because there are things that will not be understood in noise. This reveals something profound about clearing the mind. The solution is not always to think more. Sometimes it's thinking less, to slow down, in creating space, because an agitated mind cannot discern clearly. Silence before God is not empty. It is presence. It is a place where thoughts begin to lose speed, where emotions calm down, where what was confused begins, little by little, to align. Not by effort, but by positioning. And maybe you're living in a moment like that. Many questions, many things happening at the same time, a feeling that you need to understand everything now. But this word brings a different direction. Stop. Breathe. Silence. Because some answers don't come in the form of words, come in the form of peace. A peace that does not explain everything, but organizes everything inside. When you learn to access this place, something changes. The mind ceases to be an environment of constant pressure and begins to become a meeting space. And in this encounter, God speaks in ways that go beyond what you expected. And if you've made it this far, maybe it's no accident. How many people are now stuck in their own thoughts, needing exactly that kind of direction? Just as this message has reached you, it can reach others as well. By interacting with this content, liking, subscribing, and staying connected, you become a channel for this peace to reach those who need it most. There are stories that don't just talk about miracles. They speak of invisible inner processes, of battles that take place in the mind before any transformation takes place on the outside. The woman of the blood flow carried 12 years of pain, 12 years of trying, searching, listening to diagnoses, facing limitations. But it wasn't just the body that was injured. Her mind was also scarred. Imagine how many times thoughts of giving up have tried to take up space. How many times has the idea that there is no more solution tried to become true? How many voices, external and internal, reinforcing the impossibility? Because when a situation goes on for a long time, it begins to shape the way you think. And this is exactly where something extraordinary happens. In the midst of all this, a different thought arises. A thought that does not match the reality around him. A thought that breaks the pattern. A thought of faith. For he said, "If I will only touch your garments, I will be healed." Mark 5:28. Understand this in depth. Before playing, she said. Before the miracle happened, something had already changed inside her mind. She began to state a possibility that no one else saw. This shows that the transformation began internally, before manifesting externally. Faith has that power. It reorganizes the mind. It breaks cycles of thought based only on what is visible and introduces a new perspective, not based on common logic, but on trust in something greater. And that doesn't mean ignoring reality, it means not limiting oneself to it. Because the mind that lives only by what it sees clings to circumstances. But the mind that accesses faith begins to see beyond. That woman could have remained still, dominated by everything she experienced. But a single thought was enough to move everything. A thought aligned with the possibility of change. A thought that did not come from fear, but from faith. And maybe what you need today isn't a lot of new thoughts, but of a right thought. A thought that breaks the current cycle, that interrupts the sequence of doubts, fears, and limitations. A thought that repositions your mind. Because when this happens, attitudes begin to change. Decisions are starting to be different. And paths that once seemed closed are beginning to open. Faith does not only act in the miracle, it acts on the mind that believes in it before it happens. And when the mind changes, everything starts to align from that. Perhaps, right now, God is planting this kind of thought within you. Something simple, but powerful enough to initiate a change. And it is from this that new steps begin to emerge, leading you to something that once seemed distant, but which now begins to become possible within your mind. There is a silent danger that often goes unnoticed. The isolation of the mind. When a person begins to live only within their own thoughts, without exchange, without alignment, without correction, these thoughts tend to distort over time. What seemed small can become too big. That which was not true may begin to seem real. The isolated mind loses reference. He begins to create conclusions based only on his own perception, and this does not always reflect the truth. That is why God never intended for human beings to walk alone. From the beginning, there is a principle of communion, of connection, of shared life. The early church understood this deeply. They didn't just live an individual faith. They lived together, shared, learned, corrected each other, strengthened each other. Not only did this feed faith, but he kept his mind aligned. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and in fellowship. Acts 2:42. Notice the word persevered. This indicates constancy. It wasn't something accidental. It was a lifestyle. They kept each other close, connected, walking together. And this created an environment where thoughts were adjusted, where doubts were dealt with, where truth was constantly reinforced. Because there are thoughts that are only overcome when they are exposed. When they are hidden, they grow. When they are shared with the right people, they lose strength. God uses people as instruments to bring clarity, direction, and even correction. How many times has a simple conversation completely changed the way you saw something? How many times has someone said something that brought light to an inner confusion? This is no coincidence. This is part of God's care. The mind needs this alignment. It needs that environment where truth is reinforced, where there is support, where there is direction. Because alone, the risk of getting lost within one's thoughts is much greater. And that doesn't mean depending on people for everything, but it means recognizing that God also speaks through them, that He uses connections to strengthen, to adjust, to sustain. Perhaps today you are realizing the importance of not walking alone, of not keeping everything just inside you, because the healing of the mind also goes through this place of communion, of exchange, of making room for God to use other people in your life. And if that truth is making sense to you right now, turn it into a simple statement. Write in the comments, God takes care of me, because many times this care is manifested exactly through the connections that He places in our path. There is a protection that many seek from the outside, trying to control situations, avoid problems, anticipate pain, but which in fact can only be found inside. Paul reveals something that is outside of ordinary logic, something that does not depend on favorable circumstances or immediate responses. He speaks of a peace that cannot be explained, but that is experienced. And perhaps this awakens a silent question within you. How is it possible to have peace when the mind still faces thoughts, pressures, and uncertainties? Because, normally, the peace we know is linked to what happens around us. If all is well, there is peace. If something gets out of hand, it disappears. But Paul points to another kind of reality. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Philippians 4:7, this peace exceeds understanding, that is, it does not depend on logic. It doesn't need full explanations to exist. She doesn't expect everything to be resolved. She simply keeps it. And that word is powerful. To keep. It means protecting, watching, surrounding. As if this peace works as an invisible barrier around the mind. This completely changes the way you deal with the invisible attacks that happen every day. Thoughts that arrive without warning, emotions that try to dominate, worries that insist on coming back, all this continues to exist, but it no longer finds the same space. Because there is something guarding the inside, and this peace is not produced by human effort. It comes from connection, of a living relationship with God. The more this connection is strengthened, the more this peace becomes present, not as something distant, but as a constant reality, even in the midst of difficulties. Maybe you've experienced small moments of this, moments when even without understanding everything, you felt a different calm, a security that made no sense in the face of the situation. This was no accident. It was a sign of this peace at work. And the deepest thing is that this peace not only calms, it organizes. It aligns thoughts, stabilizes emotions, brings clarity where there was confusion before. Gradually, the mind stops reacting impulsively and begins to respond firmly. This does not mean the absence of challenges, but it means the presence of something greater within you, something that guards, sustains, and directs. And as you continue on this journey, something even deeper is being prepared. Because understanding this peace is just the beginning. Living this constantly is what really transforms everything. What you will notice from now on may be exactly what was missing to consolidate this change within your mind. So stay, because there is a next step that can reveal even more about how to live this reality every day. There is a level of spiritual maturity that completely changes the way you deal with your own thoughts. It's no longer just about having good or bad thoughts. It's about discerning where they come from. Because not everything that crosses your mind has the same origin. And when this is not understood, the person can end up following directions that seem right, but they are completely misaligned. Pedro lived exactly that. In a moment, he receives a direct revelation from God about who Jesus was. But a short time later, when he hears Jesus talk about the cross, he reacts by trying to stop it. In his mind, that made sense. It was an attempt to protect, to avoid suffering. It looked like a good thing. It seemed right. But Jesus' answer was direct, firm, and surprising. "Get behind me, Satan, who is a stumbling block to me. For you do not understand the things that are God's, but only the things that are men's." Matthew 16:23, this reveals something profound and, at the same time, uncomfortable. Not all well-intentioned thoughts come from God. Not every idea that seems logical is aligned with the divine will. There is a difference between what makes sense to the human mind and that which is connected to God's purpose. And this is where spiritual discernment comes in. The ability to stop and realize, this thought I'm having, where does it come from? Does it generate peace or confusion? Does it bring me closer to God or push me away? He is aligned with the truth, or just with what seems easier. Because there are thoughts that come to accelerate decisions out of time. Others come to sow fear, even when everything points to confidence. Some seem like protection, but in fact, they are distractions. And without discernment, all of this is mixed. The mind needs to be trained to recognize these differences. It is not something automatic. It is a process of sensitivity, of alignment with the Word, of attention to the internal signs. Over time, you start noticing patterns. He begins to identify when something does not carry the same peace, the same firmness, the same clarity. And that protects. It protects from hasty decisions. It protects from paths that look good but lead away from the purpose. It protects you from living guided only by momentary emotions. Because when discernment begins to develop, the mind ceases to be a place of constant confusion and becomes a space of spiritual perception. Don't you just think, you notice. You don't just react, you discern. And that changes everything. Because now you don't follow any thought. You choose which ones remain. You filter. You line up. And little by little, your mind becomes more and more connected with what really comes from God. There is a silent illusion that holds many minds. The idea that to know is the same as to be transformed. Nicodemus was living proof of this, and mastered the scriptures, understood the laws, was respected for his knowledge. But even so, there was something inside him that wasn't lined up yet. His mind was full of information, but still stuck in a logic limited to what was visible. And this is clear the moment he meets Jesus. He comes at night, perhaps seeking answers, perhaps trying to understand something he could not explain. And so Jesus doesn't start with simple explanations. It goes straight to the deepest point. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. John 3:3, this answer completely shatters Nicodemus's expectation. Because Jesus is not talking about behavior. He is talking about inner transformation. Of something that happens in the invisible, where no one sees, but that changes everything. Nicodemus tries to understand with natural logic. He asks how one can be born again when one is old. And here is the central point. A mind stuck only in the natural cannot understand spiritual things. It tries to translate what is spiritual into human terms, and ends up getting confused. Clearing the mind also involves this transition process. Stop interpreting everything only by what is visible and start making room for a new reality. A reality where God acts on the inside, where changes begin even before they are perceived on the outside. Being born again is not an external event. It is a profound transformation in the way we think, see, interpret life. It is abandoning old patterns, limited beliefs, automatic ways of reacting, and allow something new to be built from within. And that's not always comfortable, because it involves unlearning. It involves recognizing that not everything you believed is aligned with God's truth. It involves giving up control of understanding everything to begin to live something that goes beyond comprehension. But that's exactly when the mind starts to be really cleared, when it is no longer guided only by what it sees, and she is guided by what God reveals. When the interior begins to be transformed, the exterior inevitably follows. And perhaps at this moment you are realizing that this transformation does not begin with great actions, but with an internal decision, a position of wanting to live something new, even without fully understanding everything. Before we continue, there is something that can strengthen this moment even more. If there is any area of your life that needs this transformation, something that you feel needs a touch from God, write your prayer request in the comments. Put there, with sincerity, what is in your heart. Because when you do that, you're not just writing, you are taking a step of faith, allowing this journey to reach other areas of your life as well. There is a detail that may go unnoticed, but that defines the health of your mind every day. What you allow yourself to enter. Because often the concern is only with cleaning what is already inside, but little is observed what continues to enter without filter. And that's exactly where many get lost. Nehemiah understood this in a practical and strategic way. When he decided to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, it wasn't just about raising physical structures. It was about protecting an environment, because it would be useless to rebuild and leave the doors open for constant invasions. First of all, vigilance was needed, but we prayed to our God and set a guard against them day and night. Nehemiah 4:9 noticed this balance, prayer and vigilance. Spirituality and attitude. Nehemiah didn't just trust, he also protected. He put guards, set limits, kept constant attention. This reveals a deep principle about the mind. Your mind also needs walls. It needs clear boundaries. Not everything can enter. Not every thought should remain. Not every influence deserves space. Because what enters without a filter begins, little by little, to occupy territory. And perhaps here is one of the greatest causes of mental confusion today. The mind is constantly exposed to information, opinions, contents, voices, and often without any kind of filter. Everything comes in, everything mixes, everything takes up space. And then the question arises, why is my mind so full? Because there was no protection. Just as a city without walls becomes vulnerable, a mind without spiritual limits also becomes exposed. Negative thoughts find it easy to enter. Doubts set in more quickly. Fears gain space without resistance. Protecting the mind is not living in isolation, it is to live consciously. It's choosing what you consume, what you listen to, what you allow to remain. It is to realize when something does not edify, does not bring peace, is not aligned, and decide not to feed. This requires daily vigilance, because the influences don't stop. They arrive all the time, in different, often subtle ways. And if there is no attention, the mind begins to absorb without realizing it. Nehemiah kept guards day and night. This speaks of constancy. It's not something you do once, it's a lifestyle, a continuous posture of protection. And when this begins to be applied, something changes. The mind is no longer an invaded place and becomes a protected space. Thoughts begin to filter through. That which does not add up loses strength, and what is true begins to take up more space. Because it's not enough to clean, it is necessary to preserve. And that awareness marks a new level of maturity, where you don't just react to what's going on inside the mind, but it starts to actively protect what enters. There is a level of transformation that cannot be hidden because it becomes visible in everything. Not only in words, not only in attitudes, but in the person's own presence. The history of Gideon reveals this in an impactful way. He lived in complete mental chaos. His mind was a place of constant torment, without order, without peace, without control. He was someone dominated by forces that led him to live isolated, wounded, distant from everything and everyone. No one could help him. No one could contain him. It was as if his mind was totally out of reach. And maybe, on some level, it reminds you of times when thoughts seemed out of control, when the mind becomes a heavy, confusing, difficult place to organize. But then a meeting takes place. A single encounter with Jesus. And everything begins to change. Not superficially, not just on the outside, but from the inside out. That which was disordered begins to align. What was chaos begins to find peace. And the result of this encounter is described in a way that carries a deep meaning. And they found the man from whom the demons had come out clothed in his right mind, sitting at the feet of Jesus. Luke 8:35, perfect judgment. This speaks of a restored mind. A mind that was once dominated is now in order. A mind that was once confused is now clear. And more than that, he is seated, in peace, stable, present. This transformation did not go unnoticed. People saw it. They recognized that something had changed in a real way. And that's exactly what happens when God clears someone's mind. It's not something that stays hidden. It becomes a testimony. A transformed mind becomes living proof. Proof that there is liberation. Proof that there is change. Proof that what seemed impossible can, indeed, be restored. And the strongest thing is that that man, after being transformed, wants to follow Jesus, but it gets a different direction. He is sent back. To your home. To your city. For people who knew their former condition. Because now his life becomes a message, without needing many speeches, without having to convince anyone, the transformation itself speaks. And maybe God is doing something like that to you right now. Something internal, silent, but real. A reorganization that begins in the mind, but that, over time, will be visible in everything. Because when the mind is cleared, life begins to reflect that. Choices change. Reactions change. The way of seeing changes. And the people around notice. You don't need to advertise. They see. And if this message reached you today, there is a reason. It's not just for you to hear, it is to live. Because what God does within you can become light to others. If this touched something deep inside, write in the comments, God chose me. not as a common phrase, but as a declaration that this transformation is also happening in your life, even if it is still in the beginning. There is a kind of clarity that is not born of logic, it is born from alignment. Because there are times in life when God directs, but the mind, full of noise, doubts, and interferences, cannot perceive clearly. And it's not that God isn't speaking, it's just that the mind isn't clear enough to recognize and trust. Abraham reveals a different level of response. When God calls him, he does not give away all the details, he does not explain the whole way, he does not show the destination clearly. It just gives a direction. And humanly speaking, this should generate insecurity, questioning, resistance. But Abraham's response breaks that pattern. By faith, Abraham, being called, obeyed, going to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance. Hebrews 11 notice the depth of it. He went, not knowing exactly where. This is only possible when the mind is aligned with God's voice. When it doesn't depend on all the answers to take the next step. When there is a trust that goes beyond the need to understand everything. And here's a point that changes everything. Spiritual clarity doesn't come first, it accompanies obedience. Many times the person expects to feel total security, total certainty, total understanding, and then act. But in the kingdom of God, the movement happens before the full explanation. This is not recklessness, it is sensitivity. It is a mind that has been trained to recognize the voice of God above all other noise. It is a clean mind, which is not loaded with so many interferences as to doubt at every step. Because when the mind is filled with fear, any direction seems risky. When it is full of doubts, any path seems uncertain. But when it is aligned, even without all the answers, there is a peace that sustains the decision. Abraham did not follow a map, he followed a voice. And this is only possible when there is a level of connection that goes beyond ordinary logic. When the mind learns to trust more in what God says than in what it tries to calculate itself. And maybe you're in such a moment right now, feeling that you need to make decisions, move forward, leave a place, but at the same time waiting for a clearer, more complete, more visible confirmation. And that word brings a different direction. Align your mind, and the direction will become sharper. Because God does not guide confused minds. It directs sensitive minds, minds that have learned to silence excess, to filter what does not come from Him, to trust even when the scenario is not yet entirely clear. And as you continue on this journey, something begins to adjust within you. The doubt begins to lose strength, the fear begins to subside, and the direction, which once seemed distant, begins to become more noticeable. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, and this moment is not by chance. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed may be just what was missing for you to clearly recognize the next step that God is placing before you. There are times when the mind seems to find no way out. Everything mixes up, thoughts, emotions, memories, and the internal weight begins to increase. Jeremiah knew this place deeply. He was not just a prophet. He was someone who felt intensely what was happening around him. He saw destruction, pain, loss, and it went through his soul. That is why he became known as the prophet of tears, because he didn't hide what he felt. He expressed his pain, his anguish, his confusion. And maybe it connects with something inside you right now, because there are times when the mind also feels like this, overloaded, tired, not knowing how to reorganize everything. But in the midst of this scenario, Jeremiah does something that completely changes the direction of what he is experiencing. He makes an internal decision. He chooses to bring to mind something specific. I want to bring to mind what can give me hope. The mercies of the Lord are the cause of our not being consumed. Lamentations 3:21-23, notice this carefully. He does not say that he has forgotten the pain. He doesn't say that everything around him has changed. He decides to remember something greater than what he is feeling. This is profound because it shows that the mind can be directed, even in the midst of chaos. The consolation that Jeremiah accesses does not come from circumstances. It comes from God's faithfulness. He recognizes that, in spite of everything, there is still a constant care, a mercy that is renewed, a presence that does not abandon itself. And that starts to reorganize your mind. Because when you change what feeds your thoughts, you change the way everything is interpreted. Pain can still exist, but it no longer dominates in the same way. Maybe today your mind is full of memories that weigh you down, situations that have marked, thoughts that come back often. But this word reveals a path. You can choose what to bring to mind. You can choose to nurture that which empowers, that brings hope, that connects you with God's faithfulness. This doesn't happen automatically, it's a choice. A quiet but powerful decision. And over time, this practice begins to change the internal environment. The mind is relieved, the weight decreases, clarity begins to return. Jeremiah found no consolation outside. He found it within, by connecting with something greater. And that same access is available to you now. No matter what's around you, there is a source of consolation that does not depend on it. And maybe, without realizing it, you're already starting to access this place. Every word that comes in, every truth you receive, begins to build something new within you. If this message has reached you, don't ignore it. There is a purpose in this. And by continuing on this path, you can further strengthen this transformation. If you are not already subscribed, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every word shared here could be just what your mind needs to keep being renewed day after day. There are times in life when the mind seems lost, with no clear direction, as if it were going in circles. And many times the person asks for a sign, an answer, something that shows where to go. What few realize is that God has always spoken through signs, but not everyone is sensitive enough to recognize it. The Magi of the East did not have a detailed map, they did not have all the answers, but they had something that made all the difference: attention. They observed the sky and noticed something unusual: a star. For many, that could go unnoticed, but for them, it was a sign. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Matthew 2:10. This joy did not come only from what they saw, but from what they understood. They recognized that this was not common. It was direction. It was God pointing out a way. And here is a profound principle. God keeps speaking, keeps directing, keeps showing ways, but not always in an obvious way. Often, these are details, small signs. A word that repeats itself, a restlessness that will not go away, an unexpected peace when thinking about a decision. But to realize this, the mind needs to be clear, because a mind full of noise cannot identify subtle signals. Everything gets mixed up, everything looks the same, and what could be direction ends up being ignored. The Magi didn't just see the star, they decided to follow her. This shows that recognizing it is only the first step. It is necessary to answer. It is necessary to trust that direction, even without fully understanding everything. And maybe God has already put signs before you, things that you noticed, but didn't pay as much attention to, directions that came in a simple way. But that could change the course of something important. The sensitive mind begins to notice these patterns. You begin to notice when something loads more than it seems, when it's not just coincidence, but an alignment. And this does not come from excessive effort, it comes from connection. The more the mind is aligned with God, the easier it becomes to perceive when He is pointing to something, not because the signs increase, but because perception deepens. And little by little, that feeling of being lost begins to disappear, not because you have all the answers, but because He begins to recognize the direction. One step at a time, one sign at a time. God does not leave His children without direction, but He teaches you to walk sensitively. And when the mind enters this level, even the simplest details can become confirmations that you are not walking alone, but being guided at every step. There is a detail in this story that many ignore, but which reveals one of the greatest secrets about the mind. The storm didn't start inside the boat. It started outside. The wind blew, the waves rose, the scenery changed. But what really destabilized the disciples wasn't just what was going on around them. That's what started to happen inside them. They were in the same boat as Jesus. They had seen miracles, heard teachings, walked with Him. But at that moment, all of that seemed to disappear in the face of the intensity of the situation. Fear took over, thoughts accelerated, the mind panicked. Meanwhile, Jesus was asleep. This seems strange at first glance. How can one remain at peace in the midst of a storm? But here's the point. The difference wasn't in the storm, was in the mind. The disciples looked at the wind. Jesus remained connected with something greater than the wind. And perhaps it reveals something profound about the way you've been weathering your own storms. Because there are times when everything around you seems out of control. Problems arise, unexpected situations happen, thoughts begin to multiply. And without realizing it, the mind begins to react just like the disciples, with fear, haste, despair. But then Jesus stands up, and the way he reacts completely changes the scenario. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be still, be still." Mark 4:39. This order was not only for the sea, it reveals an authority that also applies to the mind. Because there are external storms, but there are also internal storms. Agitated thoughts, out of control emotions, a constant feeling of restlessness. A mature faith does not prevent the storm from happening, but it prevents it from dominating the interior. It creates a kind of stability that doesn't depend on what's going on around you. It is a firmness that sustains, even when everything seems unstable. Jesus didn't just calm the sea. He showed the disciples that it was possible to live in another way. That peace does not have to be the consequence of a perfect environment. It can exist even in the midst of chaos. And that changes everything. Because it means that you don't have to wait for everything to be resolved to have peace. There is a place within you that can stand firm even when the landscape has not yet changed. And that stability starts in the mind. When it is aligned, when it learns to trust, when it stops automatically reacting to what it sees, something new is established. Maybe you're facing your own storm right now. Agitated thoughts, difficult situations, a sense of uncertainty. But that word reveals that there is another way to get through this. A way where the mind doesn't panic, but it remains firm. Few people will understand this truth in depth. But if you have come this far, there is something being awakened within you. Stick around until the end, because what is yet to be revealed may be just what you need to transform the way you face every storm in your life. There is a point in the spiritual journey when the mind begins to oscillate between what God has said and what reality seems to show. And it is exactly in this space that many get lost. Because when time passes, when circumstances don't change quickly, when answers seem to take time, the mind begins to question. Sarah lived it in a very real way. She received a direct promise from God. Something clear, specific, but that to human eyes seemed impossible. Time passed, age advanced, and what was promised began to seem more and more distant. And then, in a moment, she doubts, she laughs. Not out of disrespect, but because, in her logic, it no longer made sense. And this reveals something profound. Even those who receive a promise can, at some point, falter in their mind, because the human mind tries to measure what God has said based on what it can understand. It looks at time, at circumstances, at limitations, and starts recalculating. And in the process, trust can weaken. But there is a point of stability that goes beyond all this. It is not in the ability to understand. It is in the decision to trust. And let us hold fast the confession of our hope. For he who promised is faithful. Hebrews 10:23. That word, let us hold, reveals effort, intention, choice. It is not something automatic. It is an active posture of holding on to what God has said, even when everything around seems to say otherwise. Because God's promises act as anchors for the mind. When everything starts to oscillate, when thoughts start to stir, when doubts try to grow, it is the promise that he holds firm. Not because the situation has already changed, but because God does not change. Sarah, at some point, had to get out of doubt and return to confidence. Not because circumstances have become more favorable, but because God's faithfulness remained the same. And that completely changes the way you deal with time. Because when the mind is anchored in the promise, it does not despair of delay. She doesn't get lost in doubts. It remains firm, even without seeing. Maybe today you are in one of those moments, where there is something that God has placed in your heart, but which has not yet manifested itself as you expected. And little by little, thoughts begin to arise, questioning, weakening, trying to make you let go. But that word calls you to another place, to hold, to stay. Not to give up what was released about his life, because when the mind is anchored in the promise, it finds stability. Not perfect understanding, but enough confidence to continue. And it is exactly this firmness that begins to align everything inside. Anxiety decreases, doubt loses strength, and hope, which seemed weakened, begins to strengthen again, sustaining you until the moment when what was promised is no longer just a word and it becomes reality before your eyes. There is a moment when the mind reaches its limit, when everything that seemed right collapses, when expectations are broken, when the future loses its meaning. This is exactly what happened to the disciples after Jesus' death. They had left everything to follow him. They believed, they trusted. And suddenly, it all seemed to be over. Their minds were filled with confusion, unanswered questions, a void that is difficult to explain. That feeling of being lost, without direction, without clarity about what to do from there. And maybe, on some level, you've experienced something similar. Moments when something inside you breaks down. The mind can no longer organize. Two disciples were walking to Emmaus, talking about everything that had happened. They talked, analyzed, tried to understand. But the more they thought, the farther they seemed to be from an answer. Until something unexpected happens. Jesus approaches, but they do not recognize him. This reveals something profound. Sometimes God is already present, but the mind is not yet ready to perceive. Jesus begins to walk with them, and instead of just revealing himself immediately, he begins to explain. He opens the scriptures. He rearranges their understanding. He aligns what was confusing. And little by little, something begins to change within them. Did not our hearts burn within us when he spoke to us on the way, and when he opened the scriptures to us? Luke 24:32 This, burning, is not a passing emotion, it is a sign of something being restored. The mind, which was once heavy, begins to rekindle. Hope, which seemed extinguished, resurfaces. And all of this starts before they even fully realize what was happening. This shows that God doesn't just solve external situations. It rebuilds the mind from the inside out. He takes what is broken, confused, disorganized, and begins to align with truth, with direction, with purpose. And maybe that's exactly where you're right now. Not totally lost, but also not completely aligned. Feeling that something needs to be rearranged within you. And just as it happened with those disciples, this reconstruction begins quietly. A word here, an understanding there, and suddenly something inside you starts to change. Clarity returns, hope reappears, and what seemed meaningless begins to fall into place. Because God has power to restore even the most downcast minds. No matter how confused you are, no matter how far away it seems, there is a way back. There is a process of reconstruction going on. And if somehow this message is bringing clarity to you, don't ignore it. It may be the beginning of this reconstruction. If this made sense in there, write in the comments. I trust in God's action. Because sometimes, a simple statement is the first step in aligning the mind with what God is already doing. There is a kind of battle that doesn't happen once, it repeats itself. They are cycles, thoughts that come and go, patterns that seem to settle in the mind as if they had a life of their own. You try to change, you try to think differently, you try to react differently, but suddenly he finds himself in the same place again. Paul speaks to this reality directly. He doesn't ignore the internal conflict, he doesn't pretend it's simple, exposes that there is a natural inclination of the mind which, if left untreated, always leads to the same path, a path of wariness, confusion, heaviness, and maybe that makes sense to you now. Because there are thoughts that seem all too familiar, worries that return, insecurities that repeat themselves, memories that insist on occupying space. And the more you try to fight with only your own strength, the more it seems like this cycle continues. But Paul reveals a secret that completely changes the way you face it. For the carnal mind is death, but the mind of the Spirit is life and peace. Romans 8:6, the word inclination here is essential. It shows that the mind will always be moving in one direction. There is no neutrality. Or does it lean towards that which pushes it away, or it leans toward that which brings life? And here's the deeper point. Victory over these cycles doesn't start with human effort. It begins with spiritual surrender. It's not trying to control everything alone. It's not trying to win by force. It is by submitting the mind to something greater. When the mind bows to God's rule, something changes. What once seemed automatic is beginning to be interrupted. The cycles begin to lose strength, not because thoughts cease to exist, but because they no longer have the same domain. It's as if control changes hands. Before, the mind reacted impulsively, repeating patterns. Now she begins to respond in an aligned, guided, conscious way, and this turns the battlefield into victory territory. But this process requires a position, a daily decision not to feed what pulls you down and to direct the mind to that which comes from the Spirit, not as something heavy, but as a constant adjustment. Over time, what was a cycle begins to be broken. What seemed impossible to change begins to transform, and the mind, which was once a place of conflict, begins to experience something new, stability. Because when the slope changes, the outcome changes. When the direction changes, the destination also changes. And what once seemed an impossible pattern to overcome begins, little by little, to lose strength in the face of a mind that is now no longer alone, but aligned with something bigger. There is a spiritual movement that few realize, but which has the power to break invisible chains within the mind. When the pain is intense, when the mind is overloaded, the natural impulse is to close off, to focus only on one's own suffering, to try to understand, to try to solve, to try to relieve it. And the more a person dives into themselves, the more trapped they can feel. Job reached one of the deepest levels of pain anyone could experience. He lost everything, faced accusations, misunderstanding, silence. His mind was crossed by questions, by anguish that seemed to have no end. Humanly, everything pointed to a complete closure, to an even greater isolation. But then something happens that completely changes the course of the story. Instead of remaining focused only on his own pain, Job begins to pray for other people. People who had even said things that hurt him. This is not natural. This does not come from human logic. This is a spiritual movement. And the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. Job 42:10. Notice this moment carefully. The change didn't happen when everything around it improved. The change began when Job's internal position changed, when he left the center of his own pain and began to look beyond himself. This reveals a powerful secret about the mind. Often, captivity is not only in the circumstances, is in focus. When everything revolves around suffering itself, the mind closes, repeats itself, imprisons itself in cycles. But when that focus is broken, something opens up. Intercession does just that. It repositions the mind. It takes its gaze off the constant problem and directs it to something bigger. And in this process, something begins to be cleaned inside. Not because the pain disappears instantly, but because it loses absolute control. When you pray for someone, there is an invisible exchange going on. You release something that is not attached to you alone. You connect with a purpose greater than your current moment. And this begins to reorganize the mind in a way that few understand. And plainly, it is Job have his situation restored. His mind was repositioned. What was once a constant weight began to give way to something new, not because he ignored what he experienced, but because he moved beyond that. And maybe that's a key you hadn't considered yet. In the midst of your own thoughts, your own struggles, there is a path that begins outside of you, but that transforms what is inside. Because when the mind stops revolving only around itself, it starts breathing. She finds space. It aligns with something bigger. And in this alignment, what once seemed like captivity begins, little by little, to be broken. There is a moment in life when the mind is divided between two silent forces. The fear that paralyzes and the purpose that calls. And when this decision is not made, confusion sets in. Thoughts accumulate, doubts increase, and the feeling of being stuck begins to dominate. Esther lives exactly this kind of moment. She wasn't anywhere, she had been positioned as queen. But, faced with a critical situation, she realizes that her position required a decision. It was no longer about comfort, nor about safety. It was about purpose. The risk was real. If she presented herself before the king without being called, she could lose her own life. And at that moment, her mind goes into a conflict. On the one hand, fear trying to protect her. On the other, something deeper. A call that could not be ignored. And then comes a sentence that changes everything. And who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4:14. This question does not provide a direct answer, but it awakens something within her. It is as if, at that moment, the mind begins to align. What was once a doubt begins to gain direction. What was once fear begins to be confronted by a greater purpose. This reveals a powerful principle. The mind is lost when it has no direction, but it aligns when it finds purpose. Often, mental confusion doesn't just come from overthinking, it comes from the absence of a clear focus. When the person does not understand why they are where they are, any decision seems heavy, any step seems uncertain. But when the purpose is revealed, something changes internally. The mind finds a foothold. The decisions begin to make sense. Fear may still exist, but it no longer dominates in the same way. Esther had to choose to remain in the safe place or to respond to the call that required courage. And the moment she accepts her mission, her mind aligns. Clarity emerges. The force appears. This shows that God doesn't just give direction. He aligns thoughts when the heart accepts to obey. Because as long as there is resistance, the mind is still divided. But when there is delivery, everything starts to get organized. Maybe you're exactly at that point right now, feeling a calling, a direction, something that needs to be done. But at the same time, facing thoughts that generate doubt, fear, insecurity. And that word reveals that the clarity you seek may be on the other side of the decision you haven't made yet. Because when you take a stand, the mind follows. When you accept the purpose, thoughts begin to align with it. And just like Esther, you are not where you are by chance. There is a time, a reason, a greater reason behind everything. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can confirm exactly what you need to do from here. Stay alert, because this can be a direct sign from God for your life. There is a profound difference between trying to lead one's own mind and to be led by God. Because when everything depends only on what you think, feel, or understand, moments of confusion inevitably arise. Decisions become heavy, paths seem uncertain, and the feeling of being lost begins to grow. That is exactly why Jesus made a promise that changes everything. He knew that the time would come when he would no longer be physically present, but he also knew that his followers could not be left without direction. Then he reveals something extraordinary. They would not be alone. But that Comforter, the Holy Ghost, he will teach you all things. John 14:26. This promise is not symbolic, it's practical. The Holy Spirit not only dwells, he teaches. He remembers, he guides. This means that the mind no longer has to rely solely on its own ability to find answers. And perhaps here is something that many have not yet fully understood. The Holy Spirit does not only work in intense spiritual moments, it acts on thoughts. It adjusts perceptions, brings clarity, corrects routes silently. How many times does a thought come up differently, bringing peace in the midst of doubt? How many times does a decision that seemed confusing suddenly start to make sense? How many times does something inside you alert, direct, reposition, even without an immediate logical explanation? This is direction. A mind led by the Spirit does not cease to have thoughts, but he starts to have discernment. He begins to perceive what comes from God and what does not. It recognizes when something needs to be adjusted. She feels when it's time to move forward and when it is necessary to wait. And this completely changes the way of living, because the feeling of being lost begins to fade. Not because all the answers are visible, but because there is a trust that you are being guided. The Holy Spirit also reminds us. He brings to mind what has already been learned, what God has already spoken, what needs to be applied at the right time. And this strengthens. This aligns. This prevents the mind from getting lost in unnecessary paths. But to live this, sensitivity is necessary. It is necessary to make room. Because the Holy Spirit does not force. He leads. It guides subtly, constantly, precisely. And when the mind begins to get used to this direction, something changes definitively. Decisions are no longer just attempts, and they become answers. Thoughts are no longer confused and begin to organize. Because a mind led by the Spirit does not drift. She may even go through moments of uncertainty, but it never remains lost. There is always a direction, even if in small steps, leading to where it is necessary to go. And it is exactly in this kind of connection that the mind finds not only answers, but safety to continue, knowing that you are no longer being guided only by yourself, but by a presence that knows the full way. There are thoughts that don't come out of nowhere. They were built. Over time, repeated so many times that they no longer seem like just ideas and started to seem like truths. They are like invisible structures within the mind, forming patterns that are difficult to break. And that's exactly what the Bible calls strongholds. A fortress is not formed in a day. It starts with a small, almost imperceptible lie. Something someone said, an experience that marked, a misinterpretation of a situation. And then, this idea begins to repeat itself. Once, twice, several times, until it becomes part of the way the person thinks. And the most dangerous thing is that, after a while, the person no longer questions. She just accepts it. As if that were definitive. As if there was no other way to see it. Paul reveals that these strongholds exist, but it also reveals something even more powerful. They can be destroyed. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God for the pulling down of strongholds. 2 Corinthians 10:4. This completely changes the perspective, because it means that no matter how strong that structure looks, it is not permanent. It can be broken, but not by human effort alone, by divine intervention. And here's the central point. Every fortress is sustained by a lie. And every lie loses strength when confronted with the truth. Perhaps there are thoughts within you that have already become automatic. Ideas like, I can't do it. This will never change. I've always been like this. And the more these phrases are repeated, the more they seem true. But the question is, who said that? Where did this idea come from? It is in line with what God says? Or was it built over time without being questioned? Because when God's truth comes in, it doesn't just comfort, she confronts. It exposes what is not aligned. It reveals that many of these strongholds are based on distortions, not reality. And this process can be uncomfortable because it involves deconstructing something that already seemed solid. But that's exactly where liberation begins. When you start replacing those lies with the truth, something starts to fall apart. What seemed fixed begins to weaken. And little by little, the mind is being reconfigured. It doesn't happen all at once, but it happens. Each time you choose to believe the truth instead of the lie, a part of that fortitude loses strength. Every time you reject a thought that doesn't come from God, a fissure opens. Until at a certain point, what once dominated it no longer has the same power. And the mind, which was previously trapped in invisible structures, begins to experience something new. Freedom, clarity, lightness. Because when God enters into this process, He doesn't just point out the problem. It destroys that which has held you back, rebuilding your mind on a foundation that can no longer be shaken. There is a moment when the mind fails, not for lack of faith, not for lack of love, but because of the pressure, the fear, the confusion. Pedro lived exactly that. He walked with Jesus, listened to every teaching, witnessed miracles. But in the face of a moment of tension, his mind did not sustain what his heart believed. When confronted, he denied it. Not once, but 3 times. And at that moment, something broke inside him. It wasn't just a mistake. It was an internal weight, a guilt that began to take up space in the mind. The memory of the failure, the awareness of what he had done, all this began to echo. And maybe it touches something deep inside you. Because there are times when the mind also fails. Decisions that didn't go as they should. Words that came out the wrong way. Attitudes that don't reflect who you really want to be. And after that comes the weight. Repetitive thinking comes. The feeling of detachment comes. Peter could have remained in this place, stuck with his own failure, defined by that moment. But something happens that completely changes the course of the story. Jesus is resurrected and meets Pedro again. And this meeting is not marked by accusation, nor by demand. Jesus does not begin by reminding us of the error. He begins by asking a heart-wrenching question. Do you love me? This question is not about the past. It's about reconnection. It's about bringing Pedro back. And with each answer, Jesus releases a word that redefines his identity. Feed my sheep. John 21:17. This is profound, because it shows that God does not discard minds that fail. It restores. He doesn't reduce you to your worst moment. It reconnects you to your purpose. Pedro, who was previously taken by guilt and confusion, begins to be repositioned. His mind, which was loaded with negative memories, begins to be renewed by a new direction. He stops seeing himself as someone who has failed and starts to see himself as someone who has been called. And that changes everything. Because restoration is not just about being forgiven. It's about having your mind reorganized. It's about getting out of the cycle of guilt and getting into a place of purpose. It's about understanding that error doesn't define the destination. When there is a true encounter with God, maybe you're carrying something similar. A memory, a failure, something that still weighs you when you think about it. But this word reveals that there is reconnection. There is catering. There is a new beginning that does not ignore what happened, but it doesn't tie you to that either. And just like Peter, you can leave this place with a renewed mind, with a reaffirmed identity, and with a new direction before you. By the end of this video, you'll notice something different inside of you, something being adjusted, reorganized, restored. Because when God enters into this process, He doesn't just clear the mind, it gives back meaning, purpose, and peace to continue. There is a moment when everything changes, not by effort, not by attempt, but by a real encounter with the presence of God. Isaiah lived exactly that. Until then, he was a man like any other with his routine, his thoughts, his limited perception of reality. but in an instant, he is led to a vision that completely shatters everything he once knew. He sees the glory of God. And this vision does not only bring admiration, it brings revelation. Because when someone really comes across the presence of God, the first thing that happens is not to look outside, it is looking inside. Isaiah immediately recognizes his own condition. He notices something that was perhaps not so clear before. This shows a profound principle. The closer to God's presence, the clearer the truth within us becomes. This encounter does not destroy Isaiah, it transforms. That which could only generate fear, generates surrender. He doesn't run away, he doesn't hide, he gives himself away. And in that process, something happens to his mind. That old perception begins to be replaced by a new vision. The way of thinking changes. The way of seeing changes. Purification takes place, and soon after comes the call. After this I heard the voice of the Lord, saying, Whom shall I send, and who shall go for us? Isaiah 6:8. Notice the sequence. First the encounter, then the transformation, and then the purpose. This reveals that a surrendered mind is not only clean, it is prepared. Prepared for something greater, for something that goes beyond itself. And Isaiah's answer does not come with doubt. It does not come with hesitation. It comes with total surrender. Here I am, send me. This is the mark of a completely surrendered mind. It's no longer about control. It's no longer about understanding everything. It's about availability. It's about being aligned with God's will regardless of what that means. And perhaps this is the deepest point of this whole journey. Because clearing the mind is not just about taking away what is bad, it is to bring the mind to a place of total surrender, where there is no more resistance, where there is no more division, just delivery. And when that happens, life changes definitively. Because now it's no longer you trying to drive everything. It's God leading through you. The mind becomes an instrument. Decisions become directed. And the purpose begins to manifest clearly. Perhaps, at this moment, you are being taken to exactly that place. A place where it's not just about understanding, but to surrender, to allow God to completely occupy that space within you. None of this is by chance. There is a purpose in every word, in every moment that you have come this far. And if it touched something inside you, respond to it now. Comment, I believe, Lord. Not as a common phrase, but as a position of those who decide to surrender to this new phase that is beginning. Everything that has been revealed so far has not been just to inform, it was to lead you to a place of decision. Because when the mind is touched by the truth, it cannot remain neutral. She needs to choose, to continue carrying what weighs or surrender to what transforms. And this moment now is a direct invitation to this delivery. The word reminds us in Jeremiah 29:13, "And you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart." This means that God is not far away. It is accessible. But there is one condition: true delivery. Not partial, not superficial, but complete. It's when you decide to give up control of your mind, your thoughts, your worries, and puts everything before Him. Now it's no longer about understanding, it's about taking a stand, about leaving the field of ideas and entering the field of experience. Because everything that God has revealed so far wants to become real within you. So, prepare your heart. Let go for a moment of all that is around you, and turn your attention to that moment. Let's pray together, putting before God every thought, every weight, every area that needs to be cleansed, restored, and aligned with His will. Beloved Father, your word welcomes us and reminds us that there is still a path of renewal for our mind, because it is written, "Create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew in me a right spirit." And it is with this spirit of surrender that we approach you now, recognizing that only you can touch the depths of our soul and transform what no one sees. Lord, we thank you for every truth revealed, for every teaching that has reached our mind and touched our hearts along this journey. Thank you that even when we were confused, the Lord brought clarity. Even when there was weight, the Lord brought relief. Your word found us, confronted us, and began to restore us. Now, Father, we ask you for strength and wisdom. It teaches us to live everything we learn. Give us discernment to identify thoughts that do not come from you, courage to reject what binds us, and faith to stand firm in your truth. May our minds not return to the old patterns, but be constantly renewed by your Spirit. Look, Lord, at every person who prays right now. For those who are mentally tired, bringing repetitive and heavy thoughts, it releases rest. For those who face anxiety, fear, or confusion, establish your peace that surpasses all understanding. For those who struggle in silence with emotional pain, it brings deep healing. For those facing financial hardship, closed doors, or uncertainty, manifest your provision. For families in need of restoration, it releases reconciliation and love. And to the sick, Father, touch with your power and bring healing. At this moment, in silence, each heart presents to you what it needs most: every pain, every struggle, every hidden thought. Lord, we commend everything into your hands, our thoughts, our emotions, our worries, and even what we can't explain. It takes complete control of our mind. Govern every area of our inner self and align everything with your will. May our mind become a place of peace, truth, and your constant presence. We declare that every mental fortitude is being broken now. Every lie is being replaced by your truth. All confusion is being dispelled by your light. And that, from today on, we will live with a renewed mind, firm and aligned with you. May your peace guard our thoughts and lead us every day. That we trust in you, rest in you, and we stand firm in your direction. In Jesus' name, amen. Along this journey, something profound has been revealed before your eyes. Your mind is not just a place of thoughts, it is spiritual territory. Each idea, each memory, each inner voice carries a weight, a direction, an influence. And God, from the beginning, has always made it clear that true transformation begins right there. It's not just about changing attitudes, it's about clearing, aligning, and renewing the mind for truth. You realize now that many of your conflicts did not begin without, but within. And at the same time, you understand that the peace you seek is also born within, when your mind connects with God. This message is for you. God chose you to hear this today, because there is something He wants to transform deeply in your life. And now there's a question that only you can answer. What are you going to do with all this that has been revealed? You will continue to allow old thoughts to rule your life, or will you decide, from today on, to give your mind completely into God's hands? I am very happy to know that we are together so far. This is not just a video, it is a spiritual journey that we are living side by side. And you are part of it. I want to invite you, with all affection, to leave your like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, because that way you allow this message to reach even more people who need this transformation. But I also want to meet you. Tell me here in the comments where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. Your story matters. And more than that, it can be an answer and strength for other people who are going through something similar. We are forming here a chain of faith, of prayer, of true support. And understand something, what you saw today is just the beginning. There is an even deeper level of understanding, connection, and transformation that you will yet experience. In the next video, we're going to dive into something that can open your spiritual eyes even more and teach you, in a practical way, how to live daily with a mind aligned with God's presence. Do not ignore this call. There is continuity, there is a next step, and it can be decisive in your journey. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater and His presence is our strength. Trust Him and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and see you in the next video.